Ma and Pa found a boy in the bayou one day. They found survivors of the shipwrecks all the time, but they'd never found one like him before. Ma found him crouched over a man's body, the little boy splattered with blood and viscera up to his elbows and all down his shirt front, as he scooped the raw flesh of the man's guts into his mouth. Ma and Pa took him back to the village, Pa dragging him kicking and screaming from the body. He'll stop soon, he told Ma. He won't be able to keep the meat down raw. But on the trek back to the village, he did. And on their return he was thrown into the cages with the other captives, still wailing like an animal. Salvage was a rancid and dilapidated settlement. Some tycoon had tried to build a fishing village in the swampy hinterlands many years back, but the gloom and muck had expelled anyone trying to make an honest living here. Even the town's old name had been lost to time, and Salvage was populated now by misfits, scavengers and raiders, barely held together by the ritual consumption of human flesh. When they arrived back in Salvage, Ma searched his pockets and found a ticket for the boat with a name, Deacon Cobb. Not that it mattered. Who remembers the name of their dinner anyway? Deacon wouldn't stop screaming. For days he screamed and howled until his voice cracked and his mouth bled, but still he yelled, rattling the bars of his cage and refusing to quiet down. When Pa had had enough, he had his boys open the cage and dragged him in front of the village fire pit. Gaunt faces and hungry eyes stared back at the boy as he was hauled before the assembled salvagers. Pa grabbed a knife from the flames, and as his sons held the boy's mouth open, his screams strangled with sizzling of flesh, and his tongue fell into the dirt. Pa's sons threw the boy to the ground, his screaming reduced to a whimper as blood mixed with saliva oozing from his lips. Pa leant down over him, shouting right into his face, but the boy simply stared back. As Pa pulled him to his feet by his grimy shirt front, Deacon grabbed the knife from Pa's hand, and before his sons could stop him, sunk the blade deep into Pa's cheek. Gripping the handle with both hands, he drove it deep into Pa's face until he could feel bone, and Pa fell to the ground with a bloody grin carved into his face. Pa's boys bundled him to the ground, kicking and beating this boy no older than 6, but Ma intervened, shielding him with her body as she barked at the crowd around them. When were we ever known to waste anything the swamp gave to us? Nobody could give her an answer. He's healthy, he's strong, he's a fighter. She gestured to Pa's mangled face in the dirt. Let me put him to work. Hag's Law is bad. This is one of my founding principles when I started making videos on YouTube 5 years ago to the day. I've always valued the integrity of Dead by Daylight storytelling ever since my first few videos looking into DBD's lore, and my Hag video where I complained about her lore being some of the worst in the game, I think has aged pretty well. I stand by every criticism I made in that video. I think the story is flat, Lisa's character is barely explored at all, and her tome is absurd on the face of it. We've had some pretty disastrous lore since then, but Hag sticks out as an all-time dismal entry in the grand canon of Dead by Daylight. And it frustrates me so much, because behind this sloppily construed mess that masquerades as a bio, it's a pretty interesting setting that's wasted by the story it's written into. Hag's Law takes place in what's implied to be the 1960s Deep South, maybe Louisiana or Mississippi. It takes us to a mysterious village conducting secretive traditional practices in the marshy swampland, led by an old woman who passes the knowledge of her society down in an old book. Actually, not one village like that, but 2. There's the village Lisa Sherwood came from, where her grandmother was a caretaker of ancient mystical traditions which she attempted to pass down to her granddaughter. It's where Lisa got her start with mysticism from her grandmother's notes, setting up her future existence as a killer who uses curses and hexes against survivors. And then there's the Cannibal Village, where the clan that abducted Lisa dragged her away to be eaten only for her to break out of captivity and wreak her revenge. 2 villages, 2 cultures, that both hide their traditions and practices away from the wider world. One is benign and nurturing, and the other is cruel and barbaric. Hag's Law is the story of 2 diametrically opposed societies, a clash of clans if you like. God, that would have been a good sponsored segue, wouldn't it? That's a really fascinating dynamic to me. one ripe for exploration in the backwater bayous of the deep south. And all we got from it was the hag? Like, seriously? I'm sorry not to knock our muddy queen here, but I'm sure we can do better than that. Or, specifically, maybe I can do better than that. Today's video is the first of its kind for my channel. An original chapter concept put together using characters of my own creation. Well, sort of. Both the killer and the survivor are characters who are already referenced as part of Hag's lore previously in Dead by Daylight. But they're background characters. We don't know anything about them other than that they exist. This isn't a rewrite of Hag's existing lore because I haven't changed anything that hasn't already been written. I'm just fleshing out two characters who are so thin they're barely characters at this point, with proper backstories and personalities. And I've done a hell of a lot more than that. I've also designed some perks for them and a power and add-ons for the killer in a similar vein to my Tension and Problem series, to show how I would envision these characters coming to life in. Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers, to Blood in the Mire, an original chapter concept starring Anne-Marie Sherwood and Deacon Cobb, the Butcher. As Par's children dragged his body away, an agreement was struck. Ma would take the young Deacon under her care, and she would not have his potential squandered. Her other children, 2 sons and a daughter by Pa, were all full grown and refused to help the outsider who had killed their father become a part of the clan, so Ma had to do everything herself. The boy was fed, clothed and taught from the sweat off her back, on top of her duties to the village. She was the best cook Salvage had, preparing feasts for the town that were part ritual, part social event, made of whatever and whoever they had found scavenging the bayous. Deacon took to preparing the meals with her, chopping vegetables, washing meat, cleaning cookware and boiling water on the fire pit for stews and broths. But it was the meat where he grew to excel. He learned to smell disease and rot among the stock, knew exactly how long to leave the flesh to hang on the hooks, and after he sunk his cleaver into the face of an upstart captive who came at Ma with a filthy shard of glass, he found a taste for the slaughter itself. Ma told him Pa's old way of killing. He'd cut their throat and let them hang until the blood drained out. It was easy, Deacon thought, but that ruined the freshness. His way did it properly. He'd smash the back of their skull with a mallet to settle them down, before feeding a metal spike into the nape of the neck up into the brain. Quick, little mess, and left the meat whole and tender. Over the years, Ma cooked and her adoptive son slaughtered for her, capturing and preparing the meat for the village's grisly feasts. Ma became grandma and boy became a man, leading expeditions into the bayou and even out into civilization from time to time. He had no interest in the second-hand finery the others squabbled over. He'd find the fittest captives, the best and healthiest cuts to bring back to salvage, and drag them home through the swamplands, with meat hooks lodged in their abdomen. Upon his return, the preparation would begin, each captive sorted according to their suitability, and not a single scrap of flesh was wasted. Steaks, mince, sausages, fat for crackling, skin for tanning, and bones for soup. From Grandma's cookbook, the wisdom was passed down, and the town thrived on the leadership of mother and son together. That all changed when a young girl was brought to the village, no more than 20, terrified and sopping wet in her mint dress as she was hauled in, screaming. The butcher gave her a once-over, whole, healthy, useful, and bade her taken to the meat larder where her cries would not be heard. But the raiding party that had taken her had been followed back that night, and Salvage came under attack. The sheriff's deputies had rallied the militia and led them to Salvage with guns, machetes and torches in the dead of night. Deacon rose to meet them, rousing the townspeople to action with a wordless bellow as he took up his cleaver in defence of his home. As salvagers and militiamen clashed around him, Deacon was an unstoppable force of violence, shrugging off cuts and stray shrapnel like a summer rain as he drove his cleaver, hooks, and eventually his massive meaty fists into whatever was in his path. A flash of steel in the night air, a machete swinging towards Deacon's head. He swung his arm up to block it, and the blade sunk deep into his wrist. Deacon howled, tackling the deputy to the ground and driving his knee into his chest. Blood pouring from his useless right hand, the butcher drove his left into the deputy's mouth and, with a little effort, pulled away his entire lower jaw, with much of the flesh of his neck still attached. As Deacon held the bloody mass of bone and meat aloft, he heard children cheering, and felt the hands of the salvagers on his shoulders and under his arms, hauling him to his feet. The torch smoke cleared to reveal the night's massacre. The salvagers had lost a few of their own, but the marshy ground was choked with the blood and bodies of the militiamen, with the few survivors running for their lives into the bayou. As the townspeople looted the dead and tended to each other's wounds, a throbbing pain drew Deacon's attention to his mangled right hand, at least what was left of it, hanging on by a thin strip of sinew. Almost without thinking, Deacon swung his cleaver and severed the hand, letting it drop uselessly into the muck. No sense letting it get infected, he thought to himself, as Ma wrapped the stumps in rags and bandages, secured at the wrist with the deputy's belt. "I know you want to hurt them, boy," she said, not breaking her gaze with him. "And I do too, don't mistake me. But these people," she gestured to the door of her hut, "they need you and me to keep our heads. They're sure as shit not going to do it themselves. And right now, we need to show them that salvage is safe. And you're not going to do that by chasing off into the marsh, looking to get your own back." She placed a hand on his cheek, pulling his sullen gaze up to hers. "You understand, boy?" By noon, any bodies intact enough to eat had been dragged to Deacon's abattoir, alongside the still pleading leader of last night's raid, who had so carelessly led the militia back to salvage. As Deacon silenced his whimpering with a spike to the skull, he thought on what Ma had told him. She was right, the people at salvage needed to be kept safe. It was his responsibility. But a few deputies had escaped. If any of them made it back home and told anyone where they'd gone, salvage might never be safe again. That night, Deacon called up the town's best fighters and raiders and prepared for the trek across the bayou in secret. No torches. Ma couldn't see them leave, he told himself as he fastened his cleaver to the flesh of his stump. He wouldn't chase them all the way back, just sweep the area for any stragglers and get back before sunup. Just a quick patrol, to ensure tomorrow night's feast would go uninterrupted. Let's start with the killer, a character I picked out who was alluded to in Hag's story but that we've never seen before in the flesh. At least not properly, because the cannibals are not given much in the way of spotlight in Hag's story. Despite being the catalyst that turned Lisa Sherwood into the Hag, we're not actually told anything about who they are as a group. No sense of what their societal lifestyle is like. They're just a cannibal clan, that's all we get. They exist as a mysterious entity to abduct and torture Lisa before she escapes and gets her revenge. That's it. And since Lisa's tome is all about her life before the cannibal attack, they're totally absent in her tome as well. But if you look at the stuff surrounding the Old Flesh and Mud chapter, their fingerprints are all over the map, the Backwater Swamp, its associated offering, and Hag's add-ons. In her lore, Lisa injured herself on a walk home and was abducted by cannibals who took her back to a rickety old shack in the swamp. The shack is implied to be the Grim Pantry. At the end of the story, the village search party sent out to look for her uncovers the shack scattered with bodies and Lisa missing from the dead. And in the realm description for Backwater Swamp, the villagers eventually had the place drained to find a huge quantity of unidentified corpses, or at least what's left of them. The swamp bio ends with the implication that a family of cannibals lived there, and Hag's lore indicates that the shack is just one isolated building where the family lived and hunted, winding us up in a situation similar to the Sawyer family in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where it's just one family of cannibals living out in the sticks. But as we can see in the descriptions for the specific maps in the realm, and other parts of written lore about Hag, we can see there's a bit of a bigger picture going on. Pale Rose's map description indicates that the ship is visible from a nearby village, where the residents regularly enter the swamp to hunt. And Grim Pantry's map description affirms that the shack Lisa was taken to was a part of that village. Hag even has add-ons that confirm that there were figures in the village beyond a single family unit. The cannibal village seems to have a communal cellar in which prisoners were held, a village elder who seems to give the orders and keeps a book of recipes, and, according to the description of the Scarred Hand add-on, a village butcher. They're never given a name, just the enigmatic, definite article of the butcher. And they don't speak. Hell, from the framing of the quote, there's a decent implication that maybe they can't speak. Let's go a step further here, beyond the physical attributes, because this isn't just any old butcher. This is a cannibal village, implied to bring several groups of people together in the communal eating of human flesh. In a society defined by cannibalism, a butcher would be a position of prestige. Someone who prepares the meal for consumption would be a hometown hero, you know? A perfect representative for this culture of brutality and violence, and by extension, a perfect candidate for a killer. And would you look at that? Their name is even formatted like a killer's title. Wow, isn't that convenient? Deacon led the group trudging through the muck in the dead of night, but before long the once familiar ground felt alien under his boots. No sooner had they lost sight of salvage when a thick marshland mist closed in, and the group soon got lost. Landmarks Deacon had known all his adult life were suddenly missing. The steady ground and dirt paths he'd led countless raids on had become waterlogged mud, and thick banks of cloud covered the stars. Then salvagers started to vanish, one by one. A straggler yanked into the mist as their screens were abruptly cut off, good ground giving way to a slurry that consumed another completely, and still others simply left the group wordlessly, never to be seen again. Deacon wandered the bayou alone, resorting to filthy swamp water when he almost passed out from dehydration. It must have been days as he stumbled around in the mist, but it was only when he made it back to salvage that he finally saw the sun. But what it illuminated made him sick to his stomach. When he finally staggered his way back to the village, he was greeted not by the warm embrace of the mother he hoped would understand, but instead by silence and the stench of death. Not the familiar slaughterhouse reek of blood and sweat and offal, but of decay and shit, of meat left to rot. He picked through the village, so many bodies, mauled and desecrated to be almost unrecognisable, with symbols that hurt his eyes, daubed in blood and filth on the walls. He passed his abattoir, the meat larder smashed open from the inside, and the militiamen's bodies rotting on their hooks. Strips of flesh savagely torn away from them, like a pack of wild dogs had been set loose on them. But it was only when he found Mire, her chest ripped open in a mess of shredded gore, that he sat down in Mire's hut and truly realised what this meant. He had failed Mire. He'd failed them all. If he had just listened to her, he could have been here to protect them. A monster from the bayou, raiders from another clan. Whatever this was, it was all on him. He stepped out into the morning light, fighting back tears as he collapsed onto his knees next to Mire's body. If she was still here, she'd know what to do next, Deacon told himself. She always knew what was best. A new smell invaded his nose, not the stench of death this time, but a sulphurous fog that choked him where he knelt by his mother's body. Her corpse sunk into the waterlogged ground, lifeless eyes leering at him from the mire. Footsteps splashing. The symbols on the wall of Mire's hut started to burn, pouring that thick black fog into the air in gobbets that coiled towards him. His eyes scalded by the smog, he covered his face until he awoke, in a chill that bit his skin. He was not in the bayou anymore. The ground was no longer sopping with waterlogged turf, but instead a thick, dark grass on dry ground. And he knelt not before his mother's body, but in front of a decaying manor, with tattered banners inscribed with a language he could not understand. As he puzzled over his new whereabouts, he heard shouting in the distance. The smell of engine oil, blood, and fresh meat filled his nostrils, as his mother's words at the village fire pit came back to him. He's healthy. He's strong. He's a fighter. He rose to his feet and got to work. And thus the entity claims for its own its newest servant, Deacon Cobb, otherwise known as the Butcher. Deacon's a hard-working type of fella, a hometown hero to the village of Salvage that took him in when he was shipwrecked in the bayou as a boy. They were originally planning to eat him, but his combination of resilience, ruthlessness, and loyalty to his beloved Mire saw him earn a place of prestige in the community. By name if nothing else, the Butcher is a character who already existed in the background of the Hag's lore, but I had a lot to do to turn a few bits and pieces from an add-on description into an entire character. So I started with that hand and worked backwards. What kind of guy would be attached to a hand like that? What was his life like before he lost that hand? How did he lose it? And how would it affect his life now that he would have to live without his right hand? For his design, I looked to a wide variety of places and characters from across the world of horror and beyond. Obviously, we can't showcase a cannibal butcher in mid-20th century rural America without thinking of Leatherface, especially because Bubba is also mute and works alongside a family unit. He kills for his grandpa just like the butcher kills for the villager's grandma. But a big part of Leatherface's character is that for all his strength and ferocity, he is dependent on his family due to his mental disability and is motivated primarily by a combination of fear and loyalty. I wanted Deacon to feel different, not just the dumb muscle, but a community leader who worked hard to get where he is and enjoys the privilege, trust and power that comes with being at the heart of the village's traditional lifestyle. As such, I decided a physique more like a powerlifter would be a good fit for him. Powerlifters are enormously strong athletes who eat a lot to build huge amounts of muscle mass, and this often means they're carrying a fair bit of extra fat. Weight moves weight, and as such I wanted Deacon's body type to reflect both this immense physical strength from years of hard work and his position as a leader in a culture built around consumption. His entire thing is preparing village-wide feasts for the salvagers. You bet he eats a lot, and especially a lot of protein. I wanted him not to have like Clown's potbelly, but a build more like Kingpin from Marvel or the ogres from Warhammer the Old World. This is also why I decided to make the butcher a man, despite there being no gender signifiers in the existing text. I was making a character who was built like a fridge, had a pretty grimy and realistic aesthetic, and uses a hooked weapon in one hand. I didn't want to make another killer who was too visually similar to Charlotte Day High. I wrote the lore with this in mind, came up with a description for the character and began to set to work on a power, but I encountered a minor problem. I'm a really, really crappy artist. Like, I can paint Warhammer minis okay, I guess, but I'm not painting my little plastic nuns. I'm completely useless with this sort of thing, and if I wanted to make a video out of it, I needed something, decent. As such, I consulted my best friend and fantastic artist Azula Effie-Glass, who I knew was damn more than decent when it came to concept art and character design. She worked with me throughout the drawing process based on the character brief I wrote, and she made the final concept art for him. It was absolutely spectacular. She helped me pick apart the finer details of Deacon's look from my character brief and added a few neat details on the top, like the catalyst symbol on the back of his cauldron and the scar on his lip from Pa severing his tongue. Azula is a singularly great artist, and she perfectly captured my vision for Deacon as a character, and you'll see more of her work later when we get around to the Survivor. But before we move on to Anne-Marie and the power and perk concepts of both her and the Butcher, I just want to say this video has been so much fun to make. Obviously, I write a lot of scripts for the channel as it is, but it's not too often that I get to write actual prose for anything that's not my own personal pleasure. And if you want to read the stories for Anne-Marie and the Butcher on their own, they're linked in the description in a Google Doc. The whole thing feels like a more high-value version of my Potential and Problem series. Instead of showing off my love for the classics of horror history, I'm exploring the history of Dead by Daylight's original stories, picking apart what makes them work, and figuring out what more could be done to build on or flesh them out further. This has been such a great time to make, and I do want to do this again. I have more characters planned out with stories and powers that I want to do next time. And I want to do more next time as well. Maybe get a composer in to do some theme music, or get someone in to do a model render for these guys. I want to be able to justify making these original concepts more frequently and with more production value, but I can only do that if this video doesn't underperform, or if I find myself in more situations like I am now, where I'm okay with a single high production value video kind of flopping. So if you want to see more videos like this, then share it around, spread the word. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I would love to make more videos like this and turn them into a semi-regular event for this channel. And as for the next one, whenever that may be, I'd like you guys to vote on what I do next. I have 4 chapters already set up, 4 killers, 4 survivors already paired up, and I would like you to vote on which of the 4 I do next for my original chapter concepts. Some of these are completely original characters of my own creation, and some are existing background characters in DBD, brought into focus the same way that I did with the Butcher and Anne-Marie. If you want to hear more, wait till the end of the video because we are not done with Blood in the Mire just yet. I'll be doing Deacon's power and perks later, but we've got even more lore and character work to cover first, because what's a killer without a survivor? And what's a missing young lady without a grandma putting everything on the line to find her? Friends and foes, survivors and killers, meet Anne-Marie Sherwood. Anne-Marie Franklin was born in 1895 in the swampy village of Greywater, Louisiana. The town was small and secluded, a former enclave of refugees from the Haitian Revolution that had settled and thrived as they kept the old culture and traditions alive down the generations. To their shame, Anne-Marie's parents had never learned to read, an error they sought to correct for their inquisitive little girl as young as possible. They enlisted the help of the Sherwood family, whose young boy Peter was only a year or two older than Anne-Marie, and spent his free time ravenously devouring whatever old books or newspapers he could get his hands on. They would pay Peter in buttered candies to sit with Anne-Marie and go through his books with her, letter by letter, word by word, page by page. Despite the teething problems that inevitably come from two precocious children trying to one-up each other, they got into a rhythm quickly enough, and before long Anne-Marie had caught up. As the two reached adolescence, they started keeping journals, logging down the tall tales and parables of the village elders, or writing their own fantastical stories. The buttered candies had long stopped coming, but it was clear to anyone who saw them together why the two were still inseparable long after Peter's job was done. The two married young, and while Peter founded Greywater's tiny schoolhouse, Anne-Marie grew closer to the elders, learning the oral traditions they passed down and transcribing them into texts. The more she learned about the history of the practices and what had happened to other practitioners in Louisiana, the more Greywater's isolationism made sense. To call their centuries-old practices dying would be to absolve blame from those intentionally trying to kill these practices off. Greywater was a safe haven for those who still practiced the old religion, and Anne-Marie got more involved in the elders' rituals and prayers. It wasn't long before a Bosnian Serb shot an Austro-Hungarian archduke and Peter was called up to fight in Europe. Many women of the town found themselves in positions of leadership as brothers, husbands and sons went off to fight, and Anne-Marie, pregnant and alone, took to it like a duck to water. If anyone in the village needed a peaceful resolution to a dispute, honest guidance in times of crisis, or a listening ear over a hot meal, Anne-Marie proved more than capable of the task, and she became someone the whole town grew to rely on. These duties continued even as her pregnancy developed, and Mark was born. And while she struggled to balance her new role as a mother with her life as a community leader, the community mucked in turn and ensured Mark was always taken care of, even if his mother's attention was divided. When the young men of Greywater returned, Peter was welcomed back with open arms and an 18-month-old who he'd only heard of in letters. But the war had left its marks. He had barely survived a case of typhus from a trench rat, and his strength had withered away from the sickness. Anne-Marie had always joked that her husband was old before his time, but these jokes rang hollow when Peter's shaking hands were clasped around a walking stick before the age of 30. Nevertheless, they were back together at last, and Greywater prospered as the community filled up again. The Sherwoods soon saw a second boy, Etienne, join the family, and Peter regularly took his sons on trips into the city to buy books and maps. But by Mark's 10th birthday, Peter's sickness had returned in force, and Anne-Marie's entire world was ripped out from under her. Prayer and antibiotics could not save him. Did you realise our oldest female survivor is probably Jane? We have our fair share of older men with Bill Overbeck and Ash Williams, sorry Bruce, but an old lady survivor is something I've wanted to see for ages. And when we learned we were going to get a mystic survivor with boon totems way back in 2021, I was dreaming that we would get Hag's grandmother to bring boon totems to the game, just like Hag herself brought hexes into the game. I even said this back in my original video on Michaela when she came out. I've made my distaste for the Hag's lore completely apparent on several occasions, and Behaviour's desire to revisit how DBD presents witchcraft provided the perfect opportunity to revamp Lisa's lore by tying it in with the new survivor. Lisa's grandmother is a character who exists in both the Hag's base lore and her tome, and Lisa's interactions with her are hands down the best part of her tome. So what happened to her grandma when Lisa was taken? Until Elodie and Felix, the impact on someone's loved one when they were taken by the entity was rarely explored. Imagine how hard it must have been for her grandmother. worried about what had happened to Lisa, certain that she hadn't done enough to protect her, and full of guilt that she failed to safeguard her own family. If Lisa's grandmother had been the survivor for this chapter, it would have been a great opportunity to check back on what impact Lisa's disappearance had on her family, and explore the occult world she came from in greater detail. That video was not good, one of my worst videos ever. Maybe my script writing and analysis skills were a lot worse than they are today, to the point that I made an entire video ranting about how much that one sucked. But the only thing I coped with in that entire video was the idea that Hag's grandmother could have been a great alternative choice for bringing boons into the game. And I sat on that idea for years until I found something I could do with it. Over the years I've warmed up quite a lot to Michaela, and as I looked more into the history and culture behind Hag's inclusion into the game, I gradually understood more why Behaviour didn't want to go near Hag's lore again, beyond the bare bones we got in her tome. The closer you inspect Hag's lore, the more you realise it's kind of laden down with some unfortunate implications that lean a lot into stereotypes about traditional black communities in the Deep South. Well, one specific community. In Hag's lore, we see Lisa as part of a black community in the middle of the 20th century, in a swampy area of the Deep South implied to be Louisiana or Mississippi, and that community is governed by a council of experienced practitioners who use mystical charms and rituals. While Behaviour never outright confirms a country or a religion in Hag's lore anywhere, this element is clearly an allusion to the Haitian diaspora in the New Orleans area in the mid-20th century, and the particular brand of Haitian voodoo that was practiced in Louisiana among those communities. Between 1791 and 1804, 15,000 refugees fled what was then the French colony of Saint-Domingue for the United States, and 90% of them wound up in New Orleans, with the influx of newcomers almost doubling the city's population, and many of them brought their religion with them. Haitian voodoo is a combination of various West African religions with Catholicism to create a coherent belief system that's passed down through rituals, offerings, and oral traditions of storytelling. Voodoo is one of the most misunderstood religions in the world, having been demonized across the world, and that's especially true in the world of horror, where tropes like shrunken heads, voodoo dolls, and evil witch doctors are as old as the medium itself. The original Child's Play, for example, uses the Amulet of Damballa, and an associated voodoo ritual to place Chucky's spirit inside the good guy doll, without the original consent of the series' godfather, Don Mancini. And he said after the fact in an interview that had he written Child's Play today, he would never have brought voodoo into it at all. This whole issue makes talking about Hag's lore and the historical context behind it challenging, because it's clear with the setting that they want to tell a story about this Haitian voodoo community without actually saying the words Haiti or voodoo, because, well, Hag's a killer. You might have forgotten, given how little she's seen in matches, but Hag is a vicious and bloodthirsty cannibal who uses dark cursed powers and eats people alive. And that is not a great way of avoiding all the harmful stereotypes associated with voodoo practice throughout history. Like, calling voodoo practitioners cannibals was a very common slur used against these mostly black communities that led to huge amounts of discrimination and religious and racial oppression, to the point that when I talked about making this video, few people from my community, who are natives to the area, were worried about exploring this angle any further than Behaviour already has. This creates a bit of a nightmare scenario because it makes navigating Hag's backstory a cultural and historical minefield. It's almost impossible to acknowledge where her character came from without affirming decades of bigotry and ignorance, to the point that I thought maybe I should abandon this project altogether, just like Behaviour has abandoned the Hag. But as I pondered this question, I thought maybe this part of Hag's story can be reframed, not as a negative representation of a marginalised ethnic group, but instead as a cautionary tale, a horrifying consequence of fable colliding with reality in the dark shadow of the entity. So, what do we know about Louisiana voodoo? Well, we know it's an oral tradition without a strict sacred text. It was passed down from older and more experienced practitioners down to new initiates through stories and myths and legends. A culture, a whole village soaked in that practice is going to have storytelling at the core of its lifestyle, and that's a practice Anne-Marie shared with her granddaughter as she was growing up. Looking in Hag's tome, we can see the old stories she told to Lisa, stories of her using charms and symbols to turn cannibals into swamp trees, as she warned her about the dangers of the swamp. But the joy of it is, those stories don't all have to be true. Don't step too far off the beaten track. Don't talk to strangers on the way home from school, because the monsters will get you. These are the kinds of stories every child is told growing up, whether they're part of a community of storytellers or not. And that leaves us with an important question. What happens to these stories of monsters and mysticism when the entity gets involved, and the lines between scary stories and reality starts to get a little blurry? DBD has a long-running recurring theme of horror stories and reality bleeding together anywhere the entity touches. Alan Wake, Skull Merchant, Unknown, and Michaela all have stories that function off of this concept. The idea that telling a story can one day make it real. Lisa Sherwood didn't turn into a monster because voodoo is some kind of evil witchcraft that some might consider unnatural. Lisa Sherwood turned into a monster because that's how the story goes. She didn't listen to her grandma or the other wise elders of the village. She wandered off the beaten track and neglected the cautionary tale she grew up with. So she became a cautionary tale. Listen to your grandma, don't talk to strangers, don't touch the weird symbols, and don't linger in the swamp after dark, or Lisa Sherwood will get you, just like they got her. We all know the stories, so let's meet the storyteller. The town of Greywater mourned the passing of a beloved husband, father, son, and school teacher. While the elders conducted the 9-night ritual to ensure his spirit passed over peacefully, Anne-Marie made a promise to him to keep their son safe within the boundaries of Greywater. The outside world had already taken her husband's life. She would not offer her sons up to it as well. It had stolen enough from her. As the Sherwood boys grew into men, Anne-Marie threw herself more completely into the spirituality of the elders, becoming their envoy to the rest of Greywater and leading ceremonies and rituals according to their teachings. But while Mark became a labourer in the community, Etienne was always more ambitious, following his father's footsteps as a man of learning and eventually securing a job outside Greywater as a legal assistant in the city. Anne-Marie tried to push him back towards Greywater several times, but as Etienne packed his bags, she knew Peter would have wanted her sons to live as full a life as they could, and quietly chided herself for her suspicions. While he was gone, Anne-Marie kept him in her prayers, making private offerings to Edseli Dantor every Tuesday when the sun went down. She sought both protection for her boy Etienne out there on his own, and for peace of mind for herself. But as she would find out after years of reverent prayer, the spirit of motherhood and love had more to offer than that. The day Etienne came home, his mother barely recognised him. The scraggly young man who barely fit in his father's old suit filled it out now better than Peter ever did, and he returned to Greywater a well-put-together man about town and soon-to-be solicitor. And he did not come alone. He brought with him a wife, a dentist receptionist by the name of Lucille, with a charming smile and a baby swaddled in her arms. Anne-Marie fought back tears as Etienne and Lucille brought little Lisa into the town hall and showed her to the cooing circle of elders. And that evening they discussed the future of Anne-Marie's new granddaughter. Right away, Anne-Marie was insistent on keeping the family in Greywater. Lisa had to grow up just like her own children did, and her before them, she said. Let her leave later if she truly wants to, but she should grow up among her people and learn what that really means. Etienne wasn't so sure. He and Lucille couldn't afford to just uproot their careers and move back. It was Mark who made the suggestion. He would take Lisa into his home in Greywater and he and Anne-Marie would care for her together, while Etienne and Lucille kept working in the city. At least until Lisa was old enough to choose for herself. A quick meeting with the elders in the morning settled things. Anne-Marie became Lisa's guardian and Etienne insisted on sending money to pay for her upkeep in Greywater. No sooner did the parents leave for the city, did Anne-Marie instruct Mark to set Etienne's money aside. They'd take good care of Lisa without his charity. Perhaps once she's older, that money could go towards something great. As Lisa grew up, Anne-Marie doted on her like the daughter she'd never had. She turned the public ceremonies and rituals of Greywater into learning opportunities so she wouldn't feel like a stranger when she joined the schoolhouse. And when Anne-Marie got symbolic tattoos added or extended, Lisa would replicate the symbols with ink and mud on her arms. But she always took care to wash Lisa's arms off again before too long. These symbols have power, she would say. They're not toys, they're connections to something bigger than ourselves. All our traditions and stories and the people who wrote them, if you can respect that, maybe you'll write some traditions of your own. Anne-Marie was keen to keep Lisa in Greywater. The townspeople loved her, and she knew it was safe under her protection, but Etienne and Lucille wanted her to go to a local school near the city, with more boys and girls her own age than the same few faces she knew from the Greywater schoolhouse. Begrudgingly, Anne-Marie permitted it, but as Lisa grew into a teenager, she felt more and more like she was sharing a home with someone she did not fully understand. Lisa started dressing and acting out of place among Greywater's inhabitants, and while Lisa played along, Anne-Marie knew that her faith in the old ways she'd taught her was starting to dwindle, when faced with a world so much bigger than she'd ever known before. And she was keeping secrets. When first a student, then her English teacher, and finally her best friend, all died in mysterious circumstances within just a week or two of each other, Anne-Marie thought back to those old notebooks of charms and symbology she'd made as a youngster. She'd not seen them in a while. Lisa was in her old childhood bedroom after all, but no, perish the thought. She would ask Lisa the truth about these deaths when she got home, because the way she shifted whenever Pam's name came up was far more than grief or even discomfort. It was guilt. She lit up her lantern, sat out on her porch, and waited. Unlike the butcher, who only appeared in a single add-on for the hag, when it came to designing Hag's grandmother as a survivor, I had a lot more to work with. Between the allusions to Louisiana voodoo, the brief appearance she had in Hag's tome, and the aesthetics of Backwater Swamp in general, the pieces that would combine it into Anne-Marie Sherwood were already there. I just had to put them together. The first thing I did was speak to iFelix, a fan artist who was doing a brief thing a long time ago where they drew people's OCs for free. And I was mega ultra broke back then, so I gave a brief description and doodle of Anne-Marie, which he turned into this fantastic portrait. I passed this on to Azula, and we worked together on the design. It would be unlike her, I think, to turn down an older woman, and just like Deacon's concept art, she did not disappoint. What I wanted to push for here was tradition compromised for practicality. What if you took someone who basically never leaves the village, has occupied a position of religious authority for 70 years, but ultimately had to leave and brave the swamp to rescue someone she loved? The tattoo on the arm felt like a natural choice. In voodoo, the Etzeli are the feminine Ilwa or spirits, and Anne-Marie bears the symbol of Etzeli Dantor, who is the Ilwa of maternity, representing the hard-working and loving, but sometimes angry mother figure in voodoo mythology. For clothing ideas, I looked to traditional voodoo dresses, which frequently use light colours and patterned fabrics, but obviously a long flowy dress would not look right. So I tried to recycle the material into a new, slightly more practical style, so it would still fit that make-do and men swamp dweller look, taking up above the ankles so she could wear combat boots, for example. And yes, I know survivors with backpacks are overdone, but she got taken wandering the mire looking for Lisa. Of course she'd come prepared. There's no reason this would need to be in a final design. Honestly, this entire look might be better off suited to being a skin than being the default, but one thing I will not budge on is the lantern. Unique lobby props have been a thing for survivors, ironically, since Michaela's release. Sable has her cup, Yuichi has his tape, Gabriel somehow stores an entire EMP up his ass, and I like the idea that Anne-Marie leans on her lantern on a stick in the lobby in between the trials. The Backwater Swamp maps have these little lanterns all over them, lighting up the pier. I like the idea that Anne-Marie used one to light her way in the darkness of the bayou. It seems like a very practical item to go exploring with. It helps steady an old lady over uneven ground, lights the way in the dark and puts the light source over her head rather than in front of her, so the insects drawn to its flame are out the way of her face. Plus, if we see her as this wise old swamp mystic, what's a witch without her staff or stick? Anne-Marie sat in her old chair on that hot summer night, waiting for Lisa to come home until long after nightfall. Once the moon sunk behind thick dark clouds, she went to bed, trying to ignore the quiet but terrified voice in her head. Lisa was just staying at a friend's house, or perhaps with her parents. She'll be back tomorrow. Within 3 days, half of Greywater had turned out to look for Lisa. Mark had left the town in his old pickup to race to the city. The school, her friends, her parents. Somebody had to know where Lisa was. But Anne-Marie did know. At least, she thought she did. The wind carried fumes of rotten meat and smoke from the south, nearer the coastal rivers deep in the bayou. And when Anne-Marie ran her hand through the nearest stream downwind from the stench, there was a thin film of blood on the water, with tiny strands of dark hair suspended in it. Without hesitation, Anne-Marie pulled together a backpack of supplies. Matches, oil, food, water, and clean clothes, all laden onto her back before she tied a lantern to a long stick to keep the lake flies away, and set out into the swamp, to follow that stream, and maybe see her granddaughter again. She walked along the choked stream for hours. As night started to fall, the only guide along the riverside path was the dim light of her oil lantern, as she prodded at the ground with her stick, trying to find the next place to step. Just as she felt her resolve slipping away, she found tracks 24 or more pairs of footsteps, all leading downstream. She followed the trail until she found herself in an abandoned shanty town. With every step she took, the town instilled in Anne-Marie a greater sense of unease. Something in this town did not want her here. And as she passed an abattoir full of rotten corpses, her eyes were drawn to the crude symbols inscribed in the walls in a mysterious black and red fluid. Anne-Marie brought her lantern right in front of one and her face fell. These were familiar symbols, imbued with power she'd only heard of in the stories. They hurt to look at, as if they were ashamed to exist at all, but Anne-Marie felt drawn to them anyway. Like they weren't just something familiar, but someone familiar. Almost unconsciously, her hand gently brushed a symbol on the wall, and the night collapsed upon the abattoir. Every shadow in the town converged on Anne-Marie at once, whirling through the abattoir and smashing its doors open like a hurricane. The darkness grasped at her skin, nearly knocked her off balance, but she steadied herself against her stick and planted her feet firmly on the ground. The oil lamp at the end of the stick blazed brighter as the darkness rolled around her, a tiny sun illuminating the black fog. No, hurting it. Anne-Marie lowered her stick forward like a spear and the fog recoiled away from the burning light. Something, or maybe some things within it, screamed, impossibly high and shrill, and so quiet she could barely hear it, a chorus of pain from an untold distance away. But as Anne-Marie brandished the lantern in front of her, one scream cut loud through the others, one that chilled Anne-Marie to the bone even as the fire burned hot in front of her. Lisa. It had Lisa. She faltered, and the moment of weakness was all it needed. A tendril of darkness emerged from the whirling, foggy hurricane and wrapped itself around Anne-Marie's arm. The lantern's light sputtered out. And thus the entity claimed Anne-Marie Sherwood for its own, concluding the story of the Blood in the Mire chapter concept. I've loved writing these two characters for this video. You know me, I write scripts for a living, but it's not so often I actually get to do creative story writing anymore, which is odd since I did a degree in it. And it would be tempting, of course, to wrap up this video here. Goodness knows I've gone on long enough. But anybody who's seen the Culture of Problem series will know that I like taking characters that mean a lot to me and building a power or perks around them. And what characters can mean more to me than my own personal creations? So let's get started with the meat and potatoes of these characters, with perk concepts for both of them, and first, a power and add-on concept for the Butcher. Deacon Cobb the Butcher is a tall killer with a standard movement speed and terror radius, and the power to the slaughter. This power comes in two parts, the Vicious Hook and the Taste for Violence system. To use the Vicious Hook, you simply hold M2 to raise the meat hook and charge it. The longer the M2 is held, the further the hook will go, to a minimum of 6 meters forward after a second of charging, and a maximum of 12 meters after 2 seconds of charging. The killer travels at 90% speed while the meat hook is charging. Whenever the hook hits a survivor, they're pulled 6 meters towards him, and staggered as if they fell from a great height. This stagger is removed when they take a hit. If a survivor is closer than 6 meters to the killer, they are pulled through and behind the killer in the direction they were pulled in, losing collision with the killer until the hook is complete. The Vicious Hook leaves a survivor with the unique status effect, Tenderized, that lasts for 8 seconds after they're hit with the hook. What that does, I'll tell you in a minute. The idea here is to make something similar to Deathslinger or Houndmaster, a ranged killer who uses his meat hook to displace survivors and forcibly reposition them for hits with a basic attack. I've always loved killers who have useful chase powers but get health states with basic attacks, like Slinger, Houndmaster and Pinhead, because it allows them to use effects like Expose, which are normally relegated to shitty M1s with little to no chase power. As opposed to Deathslinger, who can pull the survivors directly to him for a hit, or Houndmaster, who holds them still until she can catch up, the Butcher's Hook is a fixed 6 meter displacement in his direction, more of a yank towards him than a pull or a reel. Obviously this would need to pull survivors along objects rather than just stop when they immediately get pulled into one, kind of like how Snug slides along a wall when he's running into one. If Deathslinger is Blitzcrank, then the Butcher is more like Pike, or if Slinger is Roadhog, the Butcher is more like Junker Queen. I said the butcher is more like Junker Queen. For the last time, I said the butcher is more like Junker Queen. Right, there we go, that's more like it. Importantly, this 6 meter fixed distance ignores collision with the butcher himself. So if the survivor is hooked at a very close range, they can get pulled through him and behind him. So he needs to be careful about holding harrying at extremely close range, but it also gives him the tools to move body blockers out of the way by yanking them through and behind him. This is pretty simple, bread and butter chase power stuff, that I think feels appropriate for a character who drags people through the swamp by their abdomen. But a bog standard range attack isn't really enough for a modern day killer power, or for the discerning palate of Salvage's Master of the Feast. So let me introduce you to the Prime Cut and Taste Score system. The second part of his power is called a Taste for Violence. Each survivor has a hidden taste score. The survivor with the highest taste score at any given time is the Prime Cut, and is indicated on the HUD for both sides to see. The taste score system works as follows. Each survivor's taste score goes up by 1 for each other survivor who's been chased for a longer time than them. So a survivor who's been chased for the longest time will have a base taste score of 0, whereas a survivor who's not been chased at all, while everybody else has been chased, will have a taste score of +3, and thus that survivor will be the Prime Cut. But there are other modifiers to determine which character is the Prime Cut. A survivor's taste score goes down by 3 if they've been unhooked within 80 seconds and have not taken a thick action in that time. The taste score goes up by 1 if they spent more time healing other survivors than any other survivor in the trial has done, and they get +1 to their taste score if they were the last survivor to stun or blind the killer. Importantly, hooked survivors are discounted from the Prime Cut, so if the hooked survivor happens to have the highest taste score, the next highest will become the Prime Cut. If a healthy survivor is hit when they are the Prime Cut, they are also taken out of the running. A new Prime Cut will be assigned, and the hit survivor will be excluded from becoming the Prime Cut again until another survivor is hit. Whenever a tenderized survivor is hit, i.e. a survivor who was grabbed by the hook in the last 8 seconds, a Taste for Violence gains a charge to a maximum of 5. A Prime Cut survivor, however, is worth 2 charges. When a Prime Cut survivor is put into the dying state on their 3rd hook stage, the killer can kill them instantly in lieu of hooking in a special Mire banquet of gore. Long story short, he starts ripping bits off of them and basically eats them alive. When the killer has 2 or more charges of a Taste for Violence, they can press the active ability button to pop their cauldron down and drain all charges from a Taste for Violence. This means they sit down with their cooking pot and have a bit of a snack, gaining the meal buff for 60 seconds if 2 to 4 charges were drained, and gaining the feast buff for 60 seconds if he has 5 or more. The butcher cannot gain further charges during meal or feast. When affected by the meal buff, basic attacks with the cleaver break pallets and breakable walls on contact, and Vicious Hook can pull survivors over pallets. With the feast buff, all meal buffs will apply, plus the following. Vicious Hook's minimum and maximum range will be increased by 6 meters, and Vicious Hook's pull distance will increase by 4 meters. In addition, the butcher will gain 10% haste in any chase involving the Prime Cut. So what we have here is a built-in survivor juggling dynamic. You're encouraged to chase survivors who are actively healing, and split chases between survivors, because finding the right person and catching them out can build you towards an empowered state, which improves your anti-loop and lethality significantly. And if you can collect enough meat before eating from your cooking pot, you get a burst of haste and extra range and pull distance on top. We talk all the time about giving killers an incentive to avoid tunneling, and with the Prime Cut system rewarding you for juggling survivors and punishing you for hitting servers off of fresh hooks, that's your incentive right there. I've got a bunch of add-ons to the power as well. I'd like to take this opportunity to shout out Wheatraws, the man, the myth, the legend, who makes so many cool icons in this community. He did the icons for the power, all 6 of the perks, and all 20 of the killer add-ons. If I'd realised I was going to do all the add-ons, I wouldn't have made half of them just different variations of pieces of meat. But yeah, link to Wheat's Blue Skies in the description, so do go pay him a visit. He's a gentleman and a hero. And wrapping things up, we have the perks for both Anne-Marie and the Butcher. We're going to be starting out with the Butcher. Our first perk is Hex Gratuitous Violence. Whenever a healthy survivor becomes injured with a basic attack, a Hex totem lights up and they become cursed. Whenever a cursed survivor heals another survivor while they are injured, they are afflicted with a deep wound which they mend at a speed that scales with the rarity. The curse is removed when the mend is complete. When no survivors are currently cursed, the hex will unlight itself. Gratuitous Violence can be reapplied and relit until the hex is destroyed while lit. This is effectively meant to be a third seal mixed with Face the Darkness, but for injuries. You hit one person and the totem lights, you hit multiple people and force people to start mending whenever they heal each other, and if they want to get rid of the hex, one of them has to stay injured so the totem stays lit, and it can be permanently extinguished. A powerful anti-healing perk, but one that's necessary, I think, in a world where healing perks and medkits are as powerful as they are. And because it involves mending, that recovery time will not be affected by healing speed steroids. Our second perk is Scourge Hook Traumatize. Whenever a survivor is hooked on a Scourge Hook, all survivors who've been hooked on a Scourge Hook this match scream and suffer from the exhausted and oblivious state its effects for a short duration. Whenever a survivor is sacrificed on a non-basement Scourge Hook, it stops being a Scourge Hook, and another non-basement hook at random becomes a Scourge Hook. This is a variation on Blood Echo, where a more powerful version of the exhausted effect is tied not to health states but to Scourge Hooks. This perk is at its best in the mid-game or when combined with other Scourge perks, especially Jagged Compass, which floods the map with Scourges. The Oblivious is attached so that the perk remains useful against survivors without exhaustions, as a Scourge Hook perk is inherently inconsistent enough already, and with more limited uses, it really should have a little bit more power compared to Blood Echo. And our last perk is Grizzly Connoisseur. Whenever the obsession is hooked, Grizzly Connoisseur activates. The next time a healthy survivor is hit by a basic attack, that survivor becomes a new obsession. The last generator the new obsession worked on regresses, and any survivors currently working on that generator scream. I miss when Dead Man Switch was an obsession perk. A slowdown perk that synergized not with other slowdowns, but instead with the obsession switching builds, like Nemesis, Furtive Chase and Friends to the End. It allowed for some pretty interesting builds, and I'd like to see a powerful new slowdown option that utilized the obsession mechanic directly as a payoff for obsession switching builds. Plus, when run on its own, this one encourages you to hit healthy survivors to get your regression, and commit to them after that hit to cash in on a new obsession, so a lot like Deacon's Taste of Violence system, it rewards the killer for spreading hooks and juggling multiple survivors. It's a win-win, boys! And last but not least, we have some perks for Anne-Marie as well. After her granddaughter brought the hex system into the game, with all three of her perks being hexes, I thought it was only fair to give her grandmother a couple of boon perks, to bring her charms and wards into the trials. And I thought it would be fun to add a map perk that synergizes with totems for good measure, because I truly think maps should be used more. And if it means making Champion of Light but for maps, that's what I'm going to have to do. Anne-Marie's first perk is called See the Unwritten. Whenever you're in an empty chest holding any non-map item, you can replace it with a scribbled map. Whenever you consume a charge on any map, you gain the following benefits. You see the auras of all generators that are close to a vault or palette revealed on the map. Generators revealed this way that are regressing have their aura shown in grey instead of red. And you see auras of all totems near a vault or palette revealed on the map. Hexes revealed this way will be revealed in yellow instead. Whenever you become hooked while carrying a map, half its maximum charges are refreshed rounded up. This is meant to be the definitive map perk. Maps have just gotten a revamp, meaning I had to rework the perk at the last minute, but the core design philosophy has stayed between iterations. Most items in DBD are given dedicated perks to help you build around them. Toolboxes have Scavenger, keys have Last Man Standing perks like Left Behind and Soul Survivor to help find the hatch, flashlights have dedicated perks like Champion of Light and Residual Manifest, and even medkits can benefit from stacking with healing perks. But maps don't really have any synergy with anything. I wanted a perk that could turn a map into a one-stop shop for complex and comprehensive information, and See the Unwritten felt perfect for that. Our second perk is Boon Ageless Preservation. You see the auras of all generators within 28 meters of the boon you place, and any survivors who are working on them. When a generator begins to regress within 28 meters of that boon, it will stop regressing after 10 seconds regardless of whether or not it is touched. This is the first of the two boon perks I had in mind for Anne-Marie. I wanted this to want to be more or less a reverse ruin. Anne-Marie is a caretaker first and foremost, and allowing her to effectively ward generators from long-term harm would be a great way to mitigate long-range regression perks like Pain Resonance or Surge by pausing the regression automatically after a few seconds. It's worth noting that Ruin should work through this, as Ruin keeps a gen permanently in regression, which seems fair given that Ruin is a temporary perk with random spawn RNG, and this is a boon that can be reapplied whenever you'd like. Of course, you could always just bless the Ruin yourself and deal with the problem manually. And the last perk is Boon Soul's Fire. Whenever you bless a boon totem, it will be affected by Boon Soul's Fire until you replace the boon somewhere else or the killer snuffs it. When Boon Soul's Fire is placed, the boon totem will become ignited after 45 seconds if it is left alone. When you're injured within Soulsfire's area of effect, you can press the reassurance button if the boon is fully ignited to activate it. For 12 seconds after activation, you receive 10% haste, and at the end of this time, you will heal from injured to healthy and the boon will snuff itself, disabling Soulsfire for the rest of the trial. This speed is unaffected by all healing speed modifiers, positive and negative. This last perk is meant to be a representation of Anne-Marie's inner strength, the well of resolve she dips into, bolstered by her faith and love for her family. You set your boon up somewhere you want to take a chase later, let it mature and ignite itself over time, and then when the time comes, you cash it in for a powerful single-use heal that gives you a speed boost to help the chase you're in. It's a high-investment, high-reward perk, especially if you run it in chase with a boon, like Dark Theory or Shadow Step, and I like the idea of the ignited boon mechanic requiring you to keep the totem safe, like a killer would do with their hexes. And with the last perk, that concludes the final piece of the Blood in the Mire chapter concept. This video has been a blast to make, very creatively fulfilling for me personally, and a fitting celebration of 5 years making videos on this channel. Blood in the Mire has been a lot of things for me. It's been an excuse for me to stretch my creative writing muscles a little bit. It's been a celebration of DBD's existing lore and original characters in an era that's been largely defined by a cavalcade of licenses, and it's been a crash test for a new type of high production value video on this channel that I would love to make more of in the future. I really hope you've enjoyed this one, and if you have, please do share it around. I want to be able to justify making more of these in the future, which brings me to something I've been looking forward to. The big vote on the next original concept for the channel. Here are your 4 options. Option 1 tells the story of an advanced and ancient society brought down by an arrogant arcane scientist, and a young man caught in the middle of it, alone, confused, and so far away from home. The He Who Killed the World chapter, starring Julian Claremont and Anastrius Frayne, also known as The Apocalypse. Our second option stars a reclusive language professor forced into the Black Veil service as a translator, while a young woman born behind bars in Victorian Australia fights tooth and nail to save her parents from a grisly fate. The Crucible of Wrath chapter, starring Dr. Farhad Sharani and Emily Montrose, aka The Convict. Our third option explores a grieving father taking revenge on the mysterious organisation that stole his family from him, and a poet escaping torture, persecution and death to fall directly in the middle of an ancient conspiracy. The For Those We Lost chapter, starring Christina Flores and Duke Arnaud Dehai, also known as the Crimson Duke. And our last chapter is something a little different. In trenches along the Western Front, soldiers share stories of a spectre haunting no man's land. Meanwhile, a displaced journalist wanders the fog alone, cursed to remember what so many others have forgotten. The Fog of War chapter stars Benedict Baker and Sergeant James Henley, aka The Breacher. There'll be a YouTube community post, a Twitter poll and a straw poll with all 4 of these options on them, all linked in the description, so please take your pick and get your voice heard before the polls close. Twitter and YouTube will only let me keep polls up for a week, but the straw poll will be up until the end of September, so if you've gotten here a little late, you can still cast your vote. So, 5 years, huh? I'm going to be honest, this past half a decade has broadly been the happiest few years of my life so far. When I first started making these videos, I was miserable, a lonely and directionless fresh graduate who seemed to be the only person my age actually working during COVID. And now I get up and get to work day in, day out talking about the game I love. I am so lucky to be able to turn this into a job, and I'm going to keep riding this wagon till the wheels fall off. I've taught myself so many new skills, learned, read and watched so many interesting things I might not have known otherwise, met some truly fantastic people, some of whom have become my closest friends. And I couldn't do any of this without you. 5 years, 238 videos, almost 60,000 subscribers, and I still have so much more I want to do. There's an original chapter coming up, and I cannot wait to cover that. I've got more modern potential and problems in the future. I'm going to get back to streaming soon, seriously, I promise. And there's so many more other projects I can't wait to show you. But whatever comes next, I truly do hope you'll stick around. I could not do this without you. So, more than ever, I truly mean it when I say thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.